Good morning. How is everyone this morning? How is everyone this morning? Good morning, Miss Kathy. Good morning, Miss Michelle. Welcome. Welcome to Breakfast Club. Oh, good morning, all the way from New York. Welcome. Glad you could join us this morning. Turn me on so that you can see me. Good morning. Oh. Been a morning. We're going to try with the microphone down in front of me versus up over my head to see if sound cooperates better. Yes, good morning, everybody. We are going to learn a little bit today about quilt layouts, settings. Like if someone tells you that a quilt is on point, how to make an on-point quilt on point. We'll talk about straight sets and things along that lines. We're going to really specifically talk about the math and that goes into on-point settings as well. Oh, I'm excited you're coming to visit. I think it's Indy. I'm apologize if I'm mispronouncing, but I'm excited you're coming to visit. Yeah, we had a group in this week, Miss Jane and her friends, so it was nice to put names and to faces and see people in person. So it's been exciting. Good morning. All right. So if you read a pattern and the pattern says to lay your quilt out on point, that is for some people and beginners could be a fairly new terminology and may not kind of have an idea as to what that means. So we're going to kind of cover that this morning. So typically your most common layout here is going to be what we call and I'm going to move my head out of the way so that you can see, is what we call here a straight set. So a straight set is what you are probably most familiar with in the world of quilt layouts. Is going to be you lay out blocks in horizontal rows and vertical columns. Okay, everything is typically all the same size blocks. You could have sashing rows of fabric between those blocks, but for the most part, when we're laying them out straight across and straight down, it's what we consider a straight set. Straight sets can be what we consider edge to edge, meaning same block sewn right next to each other. Okay, like you can see there on the left. Excuse me. And we also have the option to you could put them with a solid block, a piece block, or an applique block, so you can have what we call an alternate straight set. So every other block is a different block. There's lots of ways to do a straight set. You could have applique. You could put sashing between blocks and rows along that lines. But just for basis, we'll just chat about pretty standard because we're going to spend most of our morning here focused on on-point sets and what an on-point set is. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you. So this is where we're going to spend our focus today, is talking about an on-point set, a layout, and how to piece them, how to cut them, and all that good stuff. So when you look at an on-point set here, you can see that our blocks are being laid out in diagonal rows and columns. Okay. So we're basically taking your quilt block and we are rotating it 45 degrees and setting it on point. Okay. So on point sets can also be done edge to edge, meaning that every block that you have is, oops, too many clicks. Every block that you have fills in is the same and fills in every row. Or you can also lay these out with alternate blocks. So you have solid blocks, which could be pieced, they could be solid, they could be appliqued, or they could be another block of a different pattern. So that is the other way that an on-point set has. But if you look at an on-point set, you're going to see that there are these triangles, and these that go along the side and in the corners that we use to straighten out the quilt to give it a flat edge. Because if we didn't have these setting triangles that you see here in the gray, or the corner triangles that you see in the black, you will notice that you would kind of have a funny shaped quilt. And I have pieced quilts before that we do not put a setting triangle or a corner triangle in, and we bound it or stitched and flipped. I've done mostly table runners this way, not so much quilts. But we use these setting and corner triangles to give us the straight edge that is going to go down and around the sides of the quilt. The important thing to know here when we're dealing with corner and setting triangles is to understand where the straight of grain is on your triangle and where it needs to be. We really want the straight of grain when we're using on-point quilts to be along the outside edge of the triangle. Okay, so we want the straight of grain to be around the outside edge. If it's not around the outside edge, it's not the end of the world, but you will struggle to get your quilt to probably lay flat. In the long run, you're just going to get some wavy edges because this is going to stretch over repeated time. Okay, and we're going to talk about straight of grain, Miss Nicole. Good question. So what is straight of grain? Straight of grain on a item, on a block or a piece of fabric, is typically going to be the least stretchiest direction of the fabric. Okay, so we have what we call lengthwise grain, we have straight of grain, lengthwise grain, crosswise grain, and we have bias. Okay, so let me pull up something here, and so that we can. Let me see. Give me 1 minute, and I'm gonna pull up another window so that I can. Perfect. 1 second. That way I can draw and show you. Okay, so let's pretend that this is our piece of fabric, right? So on our yardage, we're going to say that we have a selvage, okay, is down here at the bottom. Let's make that bigger so that you can see it. Okay, so we have selvage at the top of our fabric, and we have selvage down here at the bottom of our fabric. Okay. Now, when we have selvage, okay, selvage, the direction of the fabric that runs parallel to the selvage is going to be what we call lengthwise grain. Okay. So parallel to the selvage is lengthwise grain. This is going to be the least stretchy of the fabric, okay? So length of grain is what I'm going to call it. Okay, we're going to give it slightly smaller size so that you can see. Okay. Length of grain. Now, if you pick up your fabric and you kind of pull on it right there parallel to the selvage, you're going to feel that your fabric doesn't really move or stretch as much. However, if you were to go perpendicular to the selvage, you can see my kindergarten drawing skills we have going on here this morning. I'm not the best at drawing with a mouse. So perpendicular to the selvage, so that we put one selvage in one hand, one selvage in the other. You're working with 45-inch wide fabric. You're going to feel a little bit of stretch, okay? And we call this crosswise grain. Okay. So your crosswise grain is going to give you a little bit of pull, not as much as you're going to get if you pulled bias, but more than what you'll get here. So when we talk about straight of grain, we want to make sure that the outside edge of the quilt is going to have either the length of grain or the crosswise grain along the outside edge. The two edges that do have the least amount of pull to them. This, when we pull diagonally in a piece of fabric, this is what we consider bias. Okay, bias is going to be I hate to call it an enemy, but it is very, very stretchy, and it can cause you a lot of issues down the road. So when we talk about wanting to have the straighter grain along the outside edge, that means that this length of, let me get my screen here, this length across the top of the quilt, the longest edge of this piece is going to be our straight of grain, okay, or our lengthwise grain or our crosswise grain, depending upon the way that you have cut your setting triangle. Okay, so, and I'll show you in a minute, we'll have a little bit more in depth, but we want to keep the bias away from this particular edge just so that it helps to lay flat, and we want this and this in the corners to also be straight. Just as a note, that if you were going to make an on-point quilt and you were going to make a straight set quilt, okay, straight set quilts are going to require more blocks than an on-point quilt, okay, because if you think about it, a square in a straight set is 12 inches across, but when we look at on-point quilts, let me back up one here, we actually, on-point quilts are measured on the diagonal, so the distance between corner to corner is much greater in a 12-inch block than it is straight across. Okay, so yes, on-point quilts are a little bit, I hate to say challenging, but they don't require as many finished blocks as a straight set quilt would. So if you're working with, maybe you have found some blocks and you didn't finish all of them and you're kind of over it, that type of thing, you could easily make it a pretty significantly sized quilt without needing a ton of pieced blocks. Okay. So let's look at how we assemble an on-point quilt. Okay, how we cut those setting triangles. How do we figure out what size corner triangles do I need? Especially if you're kind of winging it and you're creating the pattern on your own and you're not following a pattern that's telling you what you're doing or what sizes to cut, this is going to help. Okay, so when we assemble an on-point quilt, okay, instead of going straight across, we lay out our blocks diagonally. Okay, that's pretty normal there. And we basically sew them together just like we sew together a straight set quilt. Okay, block next to block next to block, but we're going to be placing setting triangles and corner triangles on the ends of those rows to help straighten out the edge of the quilt top. Okay, so when you look at that, sometimes I would lay my entire quilt out, because laying out or trying to lay out or start piecing an on-point quilt without laying it out, you can easily get these corner triangles and setting triangles going the wrong direction. Okay, so it is helpful to lay it out so that you know which row is your center row. So row 3 in this image is the center row, and the center row gets corner triangles on both ends, whereas the rest of them are going to get setting triangles. But if you can tell, the upper half, the setting triangles go one direction, and in the lower half of the quilt, the setting triangles rotate. So once you hit the halfway point in the quilt, things kind of mirror image, if that makes sense for you. Okay. So let's talk about setting triangles. And typically in a quilt, a setting triangle, when most quilts have you cut setting triangles, they're having you cut them from a square that you're going to cut diagonally from both corners to corner. Okay? So you'll cut one corner to corner and then turn around and cut the other corner to corner. By doing it this way, it's going to give you the straight edge. Okay, straight of grain is going to be on the longest edge. This is the edge that needs to go on the outside of the quilt. So if you look at the square in the lower corner here, you can see all of the outside edges of this square are going to be the straight of grain. The top and the bottom would be, for the most part, length of grain, and the two side ones would be crosswise grain. Okay? All of the inside edges of this setting triangle, okay, so that's in the upper triangle here, this is going to be the bias edges. Okay, so the edges on this upper triangle here that don't have arrows in them, those are bias, which means when you do go to sew them to your quilt, you need to be careful. You need to not really pull them. I highly recommend starching your fabric with regular starch, Mill Yarn's Best Press, something before you even cut your setting triangles. I never ever cut setting triangles until I am ready to use them. Okay, so if you're cutting out your quilt and things like that, leave these setting triangles and corner triangles as squares until you are ready to use them, because the more you handle it, the more you can stretch it and cause it to not be quite a triangle. Okay, the math at figuring out your measurements for a setting triangle, for it to come out of a square, you're going to take your finished block size. Okay, so that's the finished size, so get rid of the seam allowance. So if it's a 12-inch finished block, okay, you're going to multiply that by 1.414. Okay, so I put up the math down there at the bottom. So 12 times 1.414 is going to give me 16.968. Okay, I'm going to take to that number and I'm going to add an inch and a quarter. Okay, that's what we need for seam allowance. Okay, which is going to give us 18.218. And then you can round to the nearest eighth inch. Okay, so you can either go to the quarter of an inch here. So this is 18.218. The next eighth of an inch would be 18 and a quarter. But if you would like for your triangles to be slightly oversized so that you can trim them down and make sure that they are, one, that you've done your math right, and two, to make sure that you truly have a straight edge and you can trim them all so that they're all a quarter of an inch away from the edge, you could go to 18 3/8. Okay, so you could go up or down. I usually go up just to make sure that they are right. So you would have to cut for every 18 3/8 inch square. That's going to give you 4 setting triangles. Okay, so you'd have to figure out how many you needed, and that's the number of squares that you would cut. Okay. Corner triangles are cut out of half square triangles. Okay, so the corner triangles, we want the straight of grain to be on the two edges. Okay, they're opposite of the setting triangle. And this long edge here at the bottom is going to be our bias edge. So again, very helpful to be very cautious when you're sewing, if you have to seam rip them out, anything along that lines. So a corner triangle, usually you're going to cut a square and you're going to cut it in half diagonally from one corner to the other, one time. Okay, and I'm going to fix that because this is wrong in the instructions. The presentation is up on the website to be downloaded, but I will correct this, so please ignore this right this second. This is once from corner to corner. Read the picture, not the words. So to determine the size triangle that you need for corner triangles, or the size square that you need for your corner triangles, you're going to take your finished block size. You're going to divide that by 1.414. So that's going to give me, if I was working with a 12-inch square, divided, it's going to give me 8.486. I'm going to add to that 7/8 of an inch, okay, which is going to give me 9.36. And if you round to the nearest eighth, you're going to get 9 3/8. Or if you're like me, like to be a little bit bigger, so I have a little more room for wiggle and trimming, you could go to 9 1/2. Okay, and then we would have our sizes. You're going to need 2 of these squares. Okay, so because each one is going to give you 2, and your quilt should only have 4 corners for the most part, and you'll be able to get all you need out of those 2 squares. Okay, now AccuQuilt recently launched last May, not last month, in May. They launched exactly like Miss Ann. We were reading pictures and trying to determine in a pattern yesterday. Some places we were reading pictures, and some places we needed to read words, and things were not jiving in the right place. So in May, AccuQuilt launched a series of 6 dies that cut setting triangles that coordinate and match with each of the cubes. Now, if you are familiar with AccuQuilt, you know what a cube is, hopefully. So a cube is the main cube, the mix and match cube, is 8 units or 8 shapes, standard commonly used shapes that we use to put together to make quilt blocks. Okay, we have some additional cubes for each shape that add additional shapes, but the main one is the mix and match cube. It's going to give you the square, the half square triangle, the rectangle, quarter square triangle, flying geese units, things along that lines. What they have done is given us a die for each cube that will give us the setting triangle and the corner triangle that coordinates with that size die or that size cube. So the ones on the lower half of the image here are your setting triangles, and the smaller squares or triangles you see at the top are your corner triangles that you would use for each cube. Okay. Now, if you're looking at that die and you're like, well, Amy, you said we're going to cut squares. Well, you can cut squares, but you can also cut your setting triangles out of strips of fabric. There are a lot of rulers out there as well. Marty Michelle is one that I use all the time. She has her setting triangle ruler that is fabulous. And this allows you to cut strips the length of fabric, okay? And then you can cut your units. So the AccuQuilt goes in the same manner as that ruler. We cut strips, and then from those strips we cut our shapes. And the strips, depending upon the size die that I put here, would be the width of the strip that you cut. We're going to cut length of fabric because that's going to give us the straightest possible non-stretchiest edge on the outside of our quilt that you can have. Okay, So length of strips would mean you're going to unfold your fabric the way that it comes from off the bolt, and you're going to refold it. You're going to trim up and square off the selvage, and then you're going to cut parallel to the selvage. Okay? So actually cutting your setting triangles and your corner triangles from a length of fabric is going to save you a little bit of yardage. Okay? It's also going to help you not have to cut awkwardly large squares and then have to cut them on the diagonal. Okay? Like for example, in our example, you would have to cut an 18 3/8 inch square, okay, multiple times. And usually that's another reason why I'll round up, is to give me a little bit of wiggle room if I don't cut a super exact 18 3 inch square. Okay. So if we look at this quilt that's here, okay, the quilt that's here right now is an on-point quilt that we consider it's 4 blocks across and it is 5 blocks down. You will need a, if you were cutting these out of squares, you're going to need 18 by 3/8 inch squares to get all of your setting triangles out of, and you're going to end up with some extras. Because we need 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. We only need 14, and this is going to give you 16, so you're going to have 2 extra squares, which is not a big deal, but it is extra that you would end up tossing in the scrap bin. And then you're going to need 2 9 3/8 inch squares. Okay, and that's going to give you what you need for your 4 corner triangles. So you're gonna need about 1 3/4 yards. Okay. If we look at this from a AccuQuilt standpoint, you're gonna need about 1 yard of fabric. Okay. You need 4 strips that are 9 5/8 inches in width if you're cutting off the 12-inch die. Now with the AccuQuilt, the fan fold is fine, but this die is going to work better with the cut and shift method because you won't waste fabric. So let me back up to a screen here. Because of this angle that we have here, so if you lay out your length of fabric that you have folded in half, so you've got 2 layers, we're going to lay it on top of here. We're only going to make sure that we cover this particular area. We're going to cut, and then we're going to pick the fabric up. We're going to slide this cut edge over and line it up just beyond the line or the die on this end. Okay, so this is going to give you, you could fan fold, but you are going to have a little bit more waste in these corners that are there. But this cut and shift works better on when you're cutting diamonds and triangles and things than what you would need. So and I based this on 1 yard of fabric. So approximately 1 yard of fabric is what you would need, okay? Because you need at least 4 9 5/8 inch strips, and then you can also use them to cut not only your setting triangles, but you can also use them to cut your corner triangles that are there. Okay. Do I have questions? Okay. Get myself together here. So if you have questions, let me know, and I'll answer questions about anything. Doesn't have to be about setting triangles. I do have when I reload the presentation, you can click these resources that are in the PDF file that you will be able to download. There is a chart there that gives you a chart of your finished quilt sizes, block sizes, and it tells you, it's done the math for you, so it tells you exactly what size to cut your triangles and your corner triangles so that you don't have to do that. for you. There's also a tutorial from, I believe it's Diary of a Quilter, for a quick little on-point quilt done with charm squares. And then the straight set quilt block math just kind of gives you an idea of how many blocks you would need of different sizes to get to a particular size quilt. So if you're trying to figure out what you wanted for a queen size quilt with your 12-inch finished squares, you would be able to figure that out. Okay, so give me 1 second. I'm going to try to pull up something here. Oh, there we go. I got it to, finally got it to capture that picture. Just show you some math. Okay, so here is a quilt program here. So let's look at this, just so you can see in terms of size and how much faster an on-point quilt can be to get to a particular size. So if I have a rectangular quilt that is 4 squares across and 4 squares down, okay, and we're going to call it a 12, we're going to say it's a 12-inch block, okay. So this is going to give me, so 4 12-inch squares across and 4 12-inch squares down is going to give me a 48 by 48-inch quilt, right? Based on a straight set. If I took those same 4 squares across and 4 squares down and turned them on point, okay, so 4 squares across, 4 squares down, okay, hold on 1 second, turned it on point, so I'm actually gonna get this so that mathematically it's the same 16 squares, there we go. So in that world it's 3 across and 3 down. Okay, so 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yeah, okay. So same number of squares as we were doing 4 by 4. We're now doing an on point, and now I'm at a little over, probably about 52-inch quilt. Okay, so a little bit bigger. But if we were, so you could, again, and it also takes the perspective of the quilt and changes it. I love an on-point quilt, especially if the block is not a symmetrical block or something that needs to sit, you know, obviously if you had an applique of a chicken, and if the original applique was created, 1 second, let me see if I can get an applique in here that's, okay, so for example, this is not going to work in an on-point quilt, okay? You've got to make sure that you can take your block and you will need to make sure that you applique it on point, okay? So when you're laying out the applique, you want to make sure that you're using the corner as one of your bases or the foundation of the bottom of your block and not using the straight edge, okay? Because otherwise you're going to end up with things that don't exactly sit in the right direction. But if you have something that is circular, it really doesn't matter with an on-point quilt. The same comes into play with, you know, stars are really fun to set on point. So for example, you know, so quick to be able to change that look from one to another, and we could, you know, it's a completely different look if we shift it to being just a straight set, okay? And so lots of differences can happen when you set a quilt on point. And like I said, you can easily add, nothing says that you can't do sashing on a quilt, okay, on an on-point quilt. It works just like sashing if you were doing sashing in a straight quilt. So if I was doing this on a rectangular or a straight set quilt, there's your sashing. Okay. All right. Well, that is a little, let's, so Miss Kathy has a question that says, can you use larger setting triangle die and still cut down? Yes, you can. So when I am, let me back up here. Let me get back to, okay. Let me get back to this screen. Okay. So when I'm piecing, if my triangles, okay, so let's look at rows first. If you are using oversized triangles, when you are piecing rows, what you want is the 90-degree corner is what you're going to match at the bottom of your block, okay? So you're going to, you would put your triangle right sides together and you're going to match this bottom corner. Your top is going to overhang. That's just fine, okay? It's not a problem. You're going to do the same. Oop, I got to remember I can't click. You're going to do the same on every one of those setting triangles. My corner triangles, if they're oversized, I'm going to fold my corner triangle in half to find the middle of my corner triangle, and I'm going to fold my block in half and find the middle of my block. I'm going to match those right sides together and sew my 1/4 of an inch, and that's going to give me excess equally on both sides of my block. Okay, and so I would do that with both corner triangles that go on the row. And once I have my rows done, I'm going to sew my rows together, and then these last 2 corner triangles will be the last things I put on. Although you can go ahead and add them to row 1 and row 5 before you start putting them together. It really doesn't matter. But again, I'm going to fold my block in half and find middle, and then find middle. And then once the quilt is finished, let me back up to this picture. I would take a ruler and I would put a square ruler up here in the corner, and I would make sure that I have a 1/4 of an inch. My 1/4 of an inch mark is right at the seam of where there's the intersection, so that I would be trimming a 1/4 of an inch away. Okay, and I'm going to do that in all 4 corners, and then I'm going to use a long straight ruler to trim all the setting triangles in between a 1/4 of an inch away from the intersection. Okay, does that make sense? And so, and for the most part, if you're going to quilt this yourself, or you're going to send it out to be long-armed or anything like that, and you're not going to put a border on it, you're just done after the setting triangles, you could ultimately leave that trimming to be done after the quilting is finished. Okay, and then you can truly square up your quilt. But if you are going to put a border on this quilt, that would need to be done before you attach the border. Okay. And if you are concerned that there's no harm in making sure that you have given those setting triangles and corner triangles a good starching and a good pressing. So no ironing, no pushing, no setting the iron down and pushing away. Just set the iron on top to give it a nice set, and then you can trim with making sure that you don't get all wonky cornered on the quilt. Okay. So yes, you can use oversize. And a lot of times, sometimes I do. I like the ability to build in a little bit more excess to be able to trim from my corners, from my intersection of my block. That's usually why I round up versus round. Okay. Yeah, so I round up versus rounding down just because of that. Okay. All right. Well, that is what I have for you today. I hope that was somewhat helpful or interesting. especially if you are new to quilting. And I have a strange little bump in my curls here this morning. But I hope that you do give yourself, if you've never done an on-point quilt before, to give it a try. It is not hard to do. Like I said, let me get this up here. Get rid of me, get rid of this. The Diary of a Quilter here, this is the tutorial, if you click the link, that she has using little 5-inch squares. So, and then how to lay it out, how to piece it. So all the information, 83 5-inch squares, and then she gives you your information. So it's a good little quick project, uses up 5-inch squares, uses up some scraps and things along that line. So, all right. Well, I hope everybody has a great weekend. Thank you so much for joining me here this morning for Breakfast Club, and we hope to see you soon. We will be back on the first Saturday in August. I don't know what topic yet. I have not made a decision. So if you have ideas or things you want me to talk about, please feel free to email them to me at materialgirl@verizon.net, and I will go back. I know I have a list in email that people have already emailed me, and we will review that. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your weekend and enjoy. We'll see you soon.